Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Jewish National Fund USA's Conversations on Zionism. My name is Abigail Zeitlin, and I'm a proud Root Society and High Society member, and am on the JNF Future Los Angeles board, where I serve as the Fuel for Truth chair. Fuel for Truth is a 7-week course that we offer to our JNF Future family to learn about how to engage in uncomfortable conversations about Israel. We currently offer this program in person in LA, New York, and Miami, and offer an online course as well. Please visit fuelfortruth.org for more information on how to register. With so much disinformation in our world today, there's never been a more important time to set the record straight when it comes to Israel. Through JNF Future, we are engaging and educating our community of young philanthropists from the ages of 22 to 40 and equipping them with the tools needed to have informed conversations about Israel and Zionism. As someone in the legal profession, I can't wait to watch tonight's episode that will take an in-depth look at the surprising legal, financial, and political response to Ben & Jerry's boycott of Israel and how Unilever is handling it. Our expert panel will also answer the question, is it possible for BDS to become a thing of the past? So please sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to our series, Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. I'm Russell Robinson, Chief Executive Officer of Jewish National Fund USA. The time has come to be the voice of what Zionism really is. We're exposing the beautiful and diverse facets and facts of Zionism. Join me on this journey, together with Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. This is Zionism.
Hello everyone, my name is Arsen Ostrovsky and welcome to this special JNF-USA panel on Conversations on Zionism. Today we're talking about the flavor of the month, which is Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I'm sure by now everyone has heard about the Ben & Jerry's boycott of Israel in July last year. Ben & Jerry's, one of the world's largest, most prominent and most popular producers of ice cream, announced that they'll be pulling out of the territories in Judea and Samaria. We later found out that they were actually intentional to pull out of Israel altogether. This decision really created enormous outrage both here in Israel, in America, and around the world. Their parent company, Unilever, is now under the spotlight. There's legal actions being taken. There's actions being taken within Congress as well. And we have three incredible speakers with us here today. We have from the UK, Natasha Hausdorff, who is a barrister and also the Legal Affairs Director for UKLFI Charitable Trust. From Israel, we have Anne Hertzberg, who is the Legal Affairs Advisor for NGO Monitor. And from the US, we have Rich Goldberg, who is a Senior Advisor at the Foundation for the Freedom of Democracies. Welcome, everyone. But before we sort of get into the real issues, I wanted to perhaps very quickly ask all of you, this action, this boycott, it seemed like it really touched a lot of nerves, a lot of raw nerves, certainly here in Israel. Overseas, calls for a reverse boycott of Benin. So I'd love if all of you just very briefly could perhaps maybe give a few words in terms of why do you think there was sort of that response and that outrage to this particular case, because boycotts are not new. This is not the first one. It certainly won't be the last one.
Sure. I mean, I think the main issue with the Ben & Jerry's decision is that Ben & Jerry's is a very beloved brand of ice cream in Israel. Israelis love ice cream. Ben & Jerry's is very popular also in America. The founders of Ben & Jerry's are Jewish, actually appeared to be supporters of Israel. So I think it really hit home for people when they really felt betrayed by Ben & Jerry's for this decision. So I think that's really why it touched such a nerve. I think the other reason was that the decision came out shortly after the war in May of this year. So when Israelis were pummeled with thousands and thousands of rockets, and then Ben & Jerry's comes out with this decision, seemingly taking the side of Hamas. So these were really the reasons that people were just, couldn't believe it, that they had made that decision.
Rich, maybe.
Yeah, I agree largely. I think this is a very well-known brand. It's not like a no-name company announcing a boycott of Israel. This is something in the United States where everybody knows the Ben & Jerry's scoop shop. Kids like getting their Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Everybody knows the fun flavors. And ice cream is also something that brings people together. It's something about togetherness, of sitting around and having an ice cream cone or an ice cream bowl. And the idea that ice cream would be weaponized in this way for really a hateful purpose of putting pressure on the Israeli government is something that I think strikes a chord. One last thing I'll say is that I think on the American left, they've seen Ben & Jerry's as a leader in the social justice movement. And people said to themselves, this is great, I'm with you. I think this is wonderful. The things you're doing, I believe in. And suddenly that movement sort of went beyond the pale and started targeting Israel and moved into the realms of anti-Semitism. And I think for a lot of American Jews, they're looking saying, why are we being targeted now?
I'd certainly agree with all of that, and also probably add that the importance of BDS is not just with respect to the economic impact, but its main significance is as a means of dehumanizing, demonizing Israel and Israelis. And of course, it's how the Nazis began their process of dehumanizing the Jewish population, leading to the enabling of genocide. There's an extremely good exhibition about this at Yad Vashem. And I think it's worth also referencing extensive research by the Amcha initiative that's shown an intimate connection between BDS and anti-Semitism at US universities. So building on all of the prominence of Ben & Jerry's and its actions in this respect, it's the underlying connection and the fact that really this is the best statistical predictor of anti-Jewish hostility measured by actions that directly target the Jewish state and Jewish Israelis.
Do you think boycotts like this, do they target primarily the state of Israel, or do you believe more perhaps Jews in the diaspora?
Well, I think in the first instance, of course, the impact is felt primarily in Israel. But it's the start of the movement that we've seen manifesting itself in the blacklist at the United Nations. And that inevitably has a much broader reach and is part of that dehumanizing process, which inevitably impacts the diaspora as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually the real target is, college kids on campus. It's a means to try to make Israel into a wedge issue, particularly in the United States, where things are very politicized at the moment. And when you look at the NGOs actually that were behind this boycott, I mean, that's really a fundamental tenet of their organizations to create Israel, to make Israel into a wedge issue in Jewish communities and in the broader communities in the United States in particular, because support for Israel is so strong in the United States in general. So that clearly is the main impact. Ben & Jerry's, there's tons of ice cream here. There's lots of alternatives. It's really not going to impact us all that much. I mean, it will hurt the company in Israel if when their contract isn't being renewed. It hurts the workers of that company for sure. But hopefully they would be able to find another alternative brand of ice cream. So again, really, it's the diaspora where these types of initiatives are directed.
I would only add that there is a bit of virtual signaling going on from Ben & Jerry's, their board, and from Unilever. We saw, obviously, an increasingly mainstream fringe movement of a part of our body politic in Great Britain under Corbyn that has moved to the United States as well. And certainly after the Gaza conflict last year, we saw elements of that fringe political movement really target Israel. And this was sort of a request from that movement to people who are involved in Ben & Jerry's corporate and at Unilever corporate to say, if you're really with us, if you're with us in this movement, you will take this action against Israel now.
Absolutely agree with that. And I'd perhaps only add that, of course, BDS here is targeted only at Israel, despite the massive real violations of human rights in other territories around the world. And if we look for a moment at the charge levied by BDS supporters of the charge of occupied territories, and even if we take that at face value, in terms of the movement that Rich has been describing, their reasoning starts to unravel when we consider that they simply do not target many major companies that operate in territories which are plainly occupied and where there have been, for the example, major transfers of population. And the Kohelet Policy Forum has documented this in numerous reports, including reports specifically looking at the fact that trade with such occupied territories is generally permitted and encouraged by other countries. So the call that Rich is talking about is, of course, not predicated on the reasons that are being proffered for it.
With over 4,000 lawyers in 40 countries, the International Legal Forum is committed to standing up for Israel and combating anti-Semitism, hatred, and efforts to delegitimize the Jewish state in the international legal arena. Whether it is holding boycotters to account, supporting students on campus, or responding to attacks from groups like Amnesty, the ILF is relentless in making the case for Israel and defending the Jewish people.
They can repeat a lie 1,000 times, but it will not make it true.
Support us in our mission.
Rich, I wanted to move on to you and talk a little bit about the anti-BDS legislation that's really come into force really in a quite incredible way here in Ben & Jerry's. We know in the US we have over 30 states now that have anti-BDS legislation in one way, shape, form or another. There's also federal anti-boycott legislation. We've seen, I think it's 10 or 12 states already investigating. I think half a dozen have said that they will already pull money out, whether from pension funds or through other entities, to the tune of, I think, almost $1 billion. I wanted to ask you, because you worked as an advisor to the governor in Illinois, who at the time, I know you really spearheaded the anti-BDS legislation there, and one of the first states in the US to do that. I want to ask if you can perhaps talk us through that a little bit about what was the impetus behind that initial bill, how you went about it, was there any pushback?
Yeah, about a decade ago, we started seeing the increasing weaponization of the financial system in some countries and pension funds, especially in Scandinavia, targeting Israeli banks, Israeli companies, threatening financial transactions with major Israeli banks. And a lot of us sort of thinking, okay, well, the BDS movement on campuses is one thing, the BDS movement targeting brands is one thing. But if haters of Israel really were to get major banks and corporations overseas to cut off their financial ties with Israel, if they were to try to move to the EU for sanctions against Israeli banks, et cetera, try to use the Iran sanctions playbook, if you will, against Israel, this would constitute a potential economic threat in the future to the state of Israel. And so we said, okay, what tools do we have? And the states in the past have taken action when there's a clear interest of the people of that state of how they're going to use their taxpayer dollars and the pension investment dollars of that state. They did it for South Africa against apartheid. We did it in the Save Darfur movement. And we did it against Iran to try to stop companies from investing in Iran's energy sector. We built on that precedent to say, let's try to say that a state should not invest their pension dollars in any company that is engaged in a willful boycott of Israel, any sort of attempt to inflict economic harm on Israel, an Israeli company, or a company that is operating in Israel for political purposes, which is the BDS movement. And so Illinois passed the first of those. It's spread across the nation. Over 30 states now have these kind of laws. We've seen them come into full force in many states, not just red states, blue states like New Jersey, states that don't even have laws, taking a look at what they can do just from a fiduciary duty to their investors and to the pensioners. In the state of New York, which doesn't even have a law, they've divested their pension system, saying, look, if you're going to try to inflict harm, Unilever, on the state of Israel, you're impacting our other investments in the state. You're impacting our investments in Israeli bonds. This is bad for our investments. So we're going to pull our investment out of Unilever. And so I think this is taking a stand bipartisan. This bill in Illinois passed unanimously, and saying we will not allow companies to engage in what is in effect corporate anti-Semitism. We will take a stand.
Natasha, I wanted to ask you, perhaps this anti-BDS legislation has dramatic effect not only on companies within the United States, perhaps that seek to boycott Israel, but also outside the United States. And we're seeing certainly perhaps in Europe and elsewhere, where perhaps banks and other financial institutions are closing accounts of groups. Are they doing this, do you think, because they are legitimately fearful of repercussions of this kind of legislation, of being prevented from operating in 30 plus states within the United States?
Well, it's hugely significant, not just in terms of the bar that it sets, but of course also on the impact that it will have for any of those companies seeking to do business in the United States. So certainly the impact of those crucial anti-BDS pieces of legislation, both at state and federal level, is significant. In terms of the UK, there are additional factors certainly at play with respect to the Unilever case. Although Unilever's US subsidiary, Canopco, is the sole shareholder of Ben & Jerry's, a key point to note is that the merger agreement under which the acquisition of Ben & Jerry's was effected requires Canopco to elect 9 out of the 11 directors as specified by the existing ones. And UK Lawyers for Israel have taken a number of steps to highlight this arrangement and the current fiasco, because both demonstrate that Unilever is not compliant with its own code of conduct. It's of course not compliant with the US state and federal laws. It's also not compliant with the Israel Competition Commission requirements, which are primarily that it must either maintain an existing franchise, arson, or replace that franchise with one that was approved by the Israeli Competition Authority. And so the announcement that we had certainly doesn't sit with the requirements of the Competition Authority. And finally, it's also not compliant with that Israeli anti-discrimination law, which prohibits the discrimination that Ben & Jerry's have entered into. And all of those factors, not to mention, of course, the misreading and misapplication of international law, which it has quoted in the statement that it issued on the 19th of July, last year, in fact, it all plays into the sorts of arguments that we see circulating, those that UK Lawyers for Israel has raised, not just with Unilever, but also with the London Stock Exchange, and also with respect to Unilever's credit rating, because clearly this development has thrown up serious concerns, ones that investors themselves may not strictly be in a position to take forward, but clearly the regulators have a responsibility to investigate.
Can there be any pressure exerted on Unilever?
Well, it looks like already there have been, I believe, 3 senators that wrote a letter in recent weeks to the Securities and Exchange Commission, noting that Unilever may have made material misrepresentations on its disclosures. So there may be a breach of U.S. securities law. And also recently, one of the largest shareholders, I believe a gentleman named Terry Smith, who I believe is a UK citizen, operates a fund that holds considerable shares in Unilever, recently also spoke out against the company really not prioritizing the needs of the company, of the shareholders, to make the company successful, because we have seen quite a significant stock drop in the company in the past several months. And they've been taking up political causes that appear to be harming the company's bottom line. So I would suspect there'll be, I'm not sure, Natasha's probably a better person, more familiar with the UK law, but certainly in the United States, there are shareholder derivative suits and other types of actions that shareholders can take to hold the company accountable. And I do know people are looking at the merger agreement and the other contracts that are at issue, both in Israel, UK, United States, to see what remedies are available. And the other really interesting thing in this case that I've noticed just from a lot of the reporting on it is that Unilever was very quick to claim that this was not a BDS action. It was still going to be operating within Israel, had nothing to do with BDS. But what's quite interesting is when you looked at the statements of the board, the independent board of Ben & Jerry's, they refuted that claim. They said, we never said that this wasn't going to necessarily involve distributing or making the product within Israel itself. And also, when you look at all of the NGOs that were behind the claim, they all talk about BDS. They all talk about the 48 agenda, apartheid in Israel. They are part of the BDS movement. Their campaigns have been on the BDS website, the BNC movement website, for over 10 years. And so it's quite, they're trying to backtrack away from that in order to prevent a lot of these measures that are coming down the pike. But when you look at the record, it doesn't really hold up.
Rich, I wanted to ask you, you're in DC, and one of the things that's been striking, I think, from my perspective here, is the responses that we've seen from members of Congress, senators, really speaking out against this boycott. We've seen, I think, as Annie said, the letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was a bipartisan letter. We've seen attorney generals speaking out against this. We've seen leaders from, I think, both sides of the aisle talking about implications and actions that can be taken. I was wondering if you can perhaps, maybe shed some light in terms of why sort of this really unusually perhaps strong political interest, and perhaps what other steps we could expect maybe in that regard moving forward.
I think people are just outraged by how in your face of a boycott of Israel this is, and how much Alan Jope, the CEO of Unilever, has tried to deny what he is doing while he's doing it. And I think that is really triggering to people. To be quite clear, if you read the merger agreement, it is absolutely clear that Unilever could have overridden this decision, that Unilever could override it today and not pull the license at the end of this year. In fact, there's a provision in the merger agreement that even says they have to have a license in Israel, which was cited by a former Israeli commerce official last year when this was announced. Secondarily, they like to say this is a West Bank boycott or this is a settlement boycott. It's not. And all of the people listening to this should understand that this is a straight out Israel boycott. At the end of this year, they will pull their license for distribution in the state of Israel, full stop. And so I think the misstatements, the deliberate attempt to confuse people, change the subject, deny what they're doing while they do it is really, really upsetting people from all walks of life and all representatives of government.
What's next on the agenda? What other steps, additional steps, perhaps that haven't been taken yet, may we expect to see in the future? Or what would you like to see happen?
Well, I'll just jump in and say I think there's a lot of avenues still to expect. Obviously, there are franchisees who we've seen publicly write to the company saying you are hurting our business and our brand. They obviously have legal options available. We have not seen sort of the next steps out of Avi Zinger, who is the president of Ben & Jerry's Israel. You would expect he has obviously been harmed or will be harmed at the end of the year and has various legal recourses. We also have not seen all the state regulators step up and investigate Unilever yet. Remember, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission for regulating at the federal level. Most states have securities laws as well that mirror federal securities laws and regulators to investigate false claims and manipulation of the market, which is what appears Unilever has been perpetrating. So I think there are a lot more shoes to drop here, a lot more pressure on Unilever. And as you mentioned, there are major investors right now who are circling saying, what is happening at this company? Why is Procter & Gamble doing so much better than us? We have the same inflationary pressures. We have the same cost pressures. Why is this company flailing in the wind? And it likely is because of things like this boycott of Israel.
And I certainly don't think we've seen the last of developments on this issue. In addition to Richard's analysis on the merger agreement, I mean, Unilever can simply overrule the BDS decision of the Ben & Jerry's board on the basis that it contravenes the Unilever Code of Conduct, which they're required to comply with. And this specifies that all subsidiaries must comply with the laws where they operate. We've already discussed all of the variety of laws which this decision is likely to contravene. And significantly, although Unilever's American subsidiary owns all the stock of Ben & Jerry's, it has waived its rights, seemingly, or so it claims, to choose nearly all of Ben & Jerry's board members. That rather suggests that the majority of Ben & Jerry's directors, if they're self-selected and answerable to nobody, while of course Unilever retains the right to appoint the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, this entity is operating less like a subsidiary, more like a division of Unilever, and there are many possible avenues to pursue on that basis. Essentially, it's a highly unusual arrangement here with the potential to create massive risk and compliance problems. And we would say that's exactly what has been happening as a result of the decision. I think it's also crucial to look back a couple of years and recognize the U-turn that Airbnb conducted after its similar decision to boycott Jews, and as a result of a number of lawsuits that were brought, it entirely withdrew from that activity. So certainly there are further avenues to pursue, as I indicated, with respect to the corporate governance code, the premium listing that Unilever enjoys despite all of these difficulties, and all of the pressure that can be brought to bear both in the US, UK, and of course elsewhere in Europe. Can only support, I think, the ultimate goal, which is that Unilever recognises that this particular course in not correcting this decision by Ben & Jerry's was a mistake.
I just want to add also that we also do need to take a look at the groups that were behind bringing this action, and people really need to start looking at the funders of those groups: Rockefeller Brothers, the Quakers, the AFSC, in Europe, European governments, the EU. And that's also another area where people need to pay attention and tell the funders of these organizations that are promoting BDS and anti-Israel discrimination, anti-Semitic actions targeting Israel, that they need to stop funding it. It's immoral, it's illegal in most cases, and that we should not stand for that.
In the broader picture, what can we, in terms of our response to the future and ongoing threats of BDS, what can we draw from this? What can we learn from this moving ahead into the future?
Well, I think we need to stay vigilant and fight every time there's a case like this that comes up, to show that it's going to be extremely costly. When the Arab boycott was taking place, in the 60s and 70s, the United States in particular really led the way on trying to fight off that boycott and secondary and tertiary boycotts. And we have to do the same thing now. We're very fortunate, at least Americans are very fortunate, that there is very strong feelings for Israel. There's strong bipartisan support for Israel, and there are lots of legal tools to prevent these discriminatory actions. And really, it's important to try to develop these models also in Europe, where I really see this being more of a problem because there is more hostility towards Israel in those countries, and unfortunately amongst government officials in those countries. So, I think Americans can play a big role in helping their European counterparts to develop these ways in which such boycotts can be prevented.
I think it's absolutely crucial to have that sort of cooperation and knowledge sharing. And it's certainly something that I know we and other organisations have been building on, especially with those international contacts. I mean, UKLFI has successfully prevented BDS using legal tools that Anna's described in numerous cases in the UK already. And a variety of legal tools have to be used because most countries don't have the comprehensive counter BDS laws that exist in the US. It's certainly developing across the board in multiple jurisdictions, but then so is our knowledge and our understanding, and I think also our ability to communicate the serious problems that arise from this sort of initiatives and the potentially serious implications for those that are looking to pursue it, not just politically and in the realm of the share price plummet, as it were, but also with respect to the legal consequences.
Rich, you're going to get the last word.
I'll say good news, bad news story. Good news is, indeed, the BDS movement is a fringe movement rooted in an anti-Semitic fringe ideology. And people at a gut level in America, at least, get it. They get it at all sort of walks of life across the political spectrum. And that's why you've seen an outrage, not from Republicans, not from Democrats, but across the aisle, from red states and blue states and purple states and everybody in between. The bad news is, corporate America, corporate Europe, corporate UK doesn't seem to have gotten that message because a lot of this is now being weaponized in a different form. It's being tucked into things that have become very popular, like ESG and wokeism and social justice movements. And where this fringe movement is making inroads is tucking in their agenda into a broader agenda. And so if you're a company that's wading into ESG, that's wading into social justice, you need to really take a step back and look at the details, because otherwise this will be a cautionary tale. You will be the next Unilever.
Last one. This has been a very heavy conversation about law, but we are talking about ice cream. Each one of you go. What's your favorite flavor?
Coffee.
As I was a kid, mint chocolate chip.
They brought that into Israel now. Finally.
Anything from Golda.
Good answer, Natasha. Good answer. I'd like to really thank everyone, thank our incredible, amazing speakers, Rich from America, Natasha in the UK, and from Israel. Thank you for your time. Thank you for what each of you are doing, and a lot of you doing together as well, which is incredible. And of course, to our to JNF-USA for hosting this panel and for this incredible series of discussions and conversations on Zionism. My name is Jared Ostrovsky. It's really been a pleasure and honor for me to moderate this incredible panel. So thank you once again to everyone.